everybody. As Christian mentioned, this sort of grew out of a freak occurrence of this matinee that we had on Saturday. We had a baritone that thought the evening performance he was going to be arriving early. And it ended up being a really wonderful experience because we do what we always want to do, but we never feel like we have the time. And that's to actually talk about the music itself. Oftentimes with program notes, we have a very historic view of the pieces, and even when we have pre-concert lectures, sometimes we actually talk about very sort of historical events. This was written at the time of the war, the Revolutionary War, and etc., etc., etc. But we have less opportunity to talk about the music itself and how the genesis of the work came to be, and sort of what often happens with vocal music is that when you have text alongside the music, automatically it becomes a little bit more programmatic. And that means that it's based off of something. It's not just music for music's sake, but that there's a story behind it, that there's an emotion behind it. And this occurrence that we did this time when this baritone came to the show the wrong time was the Dvorak's Stabat Mater, which he wrote in a period after he lost all three of his children within the span of 6 weeks, young children. And it's about, of course, the Stabat Mater's text is the text of Mary seeing Jesus die on the cross and what it's like being a mother seeing your son die. And so it obviously had direct symbolic importance to him, right? And we don't get to talk about the music like that too often anymore. And so this is more of an opportunity for us to really delve into aspects of the music, and BCCO next week is going to be performing two fantastic works by Brahms. One is a tragic overture, which I'll talk a tiny bit about, but also the Brahms Requiem, so-called a German Requiem. And it's one of the, what we call it, war horses. It's a work that's performed so often, but we don't actually, besides a few sentences that everybody knows about it, that, a German Requiem, it's in German, it's not in Latin. It's very much structured in a very different way than Latin Requiems are. But, the realization that this actually has personal significance to Brahms, I think, is oftentimes lost. Just like the Dvorak's Stabat Mater. And so we're very lucky because both of our solos for next week are actually here. I'd like to introduce them. Ellen Leslie and Andrew Padroni. Again, this is a very casual thing, but we want you to be able to, sort of break the, quote, fourth wall of performance, because oftentimes I work with students and do education concerts for orchestra, etc. And what ends up happening is that in Berkeley, I visit every single elementary school with orchestras. And then sometimes if I go to, Berkeley Bowl, I'll see the kids, and they're just like, you don't walk around at a tuxedo all day, you actually, where's your baton, It's a typical, very standard thing, like when you see your teacher at the supermarket, you're like, you shop at the supermarket? Like, yes, they don't exist just in the concert hall. In the classroom. And so our soloists here, this is an opportunity, obviously, to hear a little bit more about about Brahms himself, and then, of course, talk to them about other aspects of performing and whatnot. And so next week, as I mentioned, we have the tragic overture, but more importantly, the Brahms Requiem, which is the heart of the concert. And as I mentioned, the title is the Brahms German Requiem, given by Brahms himself. And it's not necessarily because it was sort of representing a nationalistic idea of Germany, which was obviously Europe at the time was constantly at war. So he actually mentioned, because of that, he didn't want it to get confused with some sort of nationalistic statement, and so he wanted to say, he said, if I could, I might just name it a human requiem, right? And instead of a requiem that commemorates the dead and is in the Catholic or Christian traditions supposed to be a ceremony, for the dead, it's actually a requiem that comforts the living. And so the very first opening movement is, blessed are those who are burdened, that bear tragedy. And then, it's the entire time, throughout the entire Requiem, it's a much more personal, direct statement, almost to the people that are at a funeral or those who have lost ones. The texts are directly taken from the Bible, but it's not necessarily directly religious. It's more about comforting. Like, I will comfort you as a mother comforts their child. for instance, is one of the famous texts from the fifth movement and whatnot. And so, you know, it's a fantastic moving work. Apparently, at the first performance, the audience members were crying after the first movement. He himself wrote 6 movements, and then he added well, he wrote 3 movements first for the first performance, and then he had 6 movements for the second performance. And then the final iteration that we perform is a 7-movement one, where all the 7 movements all relate. So the first and 7th movement relate. Like I said, blessed are those who mourn, and at the end, blessed are those who have died. You know, and so the second and 6th movements relate, 3rd and 5th, and then the 4th one stands alone as sort of the keystone of the entire work. But the 6 movements, he added the 5th movement, which was dedicated to his mother. And so one of the things that's always in the background, and the first thing when people talk about Brahms, is actually his relationship to Clara Schumann. And it's actually part of a broader thing that I think we're going to talk about today, which is that he had really big issues in his relationships throughout his entire life with women in general, not only his, you know, like the intimacy with his family, but also with Clara Schumann and his fiancées, he never married, and his girlfriends at the time. And so I think it's actually a really interesting way to talk about this because it directly relates to the Requiem. The thing that I haven't mentioned, which is the biggest thing, is that the Requiem was an idea that he had when he was quite young with Robert Schumann, who was quite close with Robert and Clara Schumann. But then Robert passed away, and he was greatly affected by this. And then he wrote some music, sort of inspired by Robert. And then 9 years later, his mother passed away. And that's when he wrote with full force the rest of the Requiem. And so the relationship that he had, both with the Schumanns and with his mother, are sort of the anchors for this entire piece. And the last movement that I said, in the second performance, there were 6 movements. And the last one that he wrote, the 5th movement, is actually the one where it has the text that, you know, I shall love you like a mother loves her child. And it's very gorgeous and has this moment where it sounds like it says Auf Wiedersehen. And it's really beautiful, as if, you know, it's the final goodbye. And so, you know, when he found out that his mother was dying, one of his relatives wrote to him and said, you know, your mother is quite sick. Try to, you know, if you would like to see her before she passes, you should get here as quickly as possible. And he missed it by just about a day or so. And so he came back and was very devastated, obviously. It was one of his close relationships. But, you know, Brahms is an interesting place because this is the place where I feel like there's a huge schism in music that starts to go into the 20th century until what we have today. And that's that in the classical era, when you have like Mozart and Beethoven and whatnot, you're writing within a certain musical style. You learn that musical style. And that musical style didn't change for like 50, 60, 70, 100 years, whatnot. You know, like Bach at the end of his life was considered to be old-fashioned. Right? But nowadays, we have this period where every single composer is not only what they write, right, what they're trying to say with their music, but they invent a whole musical language. That's their voice. We talk about 21st century composers and their musical style. Every single one of them will create a new musical style, whereas in Mozart's and Beethoven's time, and Haydn's time, you had a musical style from which within you wrote, right? And Brahms is at that one place where it starts to schism, right? And that's when he was approached by Liszt. He was quite young, and he was taking music to all these major, you know, musicians around, just wanted to see, you know, if he had any talent or whatnot. And when he went to Liszt, Liszt absolutely loved it. Liszt said, "You are absolutely fantastic. I want you to be part of my cohort of composers." And I don't know why he did this, but Brahms didn't like the music of Liszt, and so he just rejected Liszt's entreaties, which begs the question why he went to Liszt in the first place. But so what ended up happening is that later on, when Brahms became more popular, Liszt and his entire crew actually would disparage his music. And it became this big schism between the sort of expanding expressionism of music and the so-called sort of classical continuation of tradition from which Brahms is in. And so by the time you get to Wagner, which is taking music to its extremes, and then you get to the 20th century, you have like Schoenberg, you have all these people creating these musical styles, they're all at the same time. It's really at this point where I feel that you have Brahms, Liszt, this schism right here, where you start to change how music is, sort of the context in which you're writing. So luckily, Brahms went to the Schumanns, because Robert and Clara Schumann were famous musicians at the time. Robert Schumann was actually more of a music critic and a composer, and he wanted to be a pianist, and was a fantastic pianist, but then he built this contraption that would exercise his fingers, when he wasn't playing, and it actually crippled him. And so he couldn't become a classical pianist. And Clara Schumann was groomed by her father to be a fantastic pianist and actually concertized all over Europe, and had to struggle with the idea of being female and her career. At the time, like Fanny Mendelssohn and Felix Mendelssohn, they were equal in musical talent. Fanny Mendelssohn actually was considered to be the more talented of the two, but because Felix was male, he was encouraged to be, a composer. But Clara Schumann balanced that quite a bit throughout her entire career and managed a career as a concert pianist constantly. And so when Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann heard the work of Brahms, Robert wrote into his journal, he said, Johannes Brahms, a genius. They couldn't have been, it was great. Robert Schumann was at the desk and Brahms started playing, and after he played just like 5 bars, Robert said, no, wait, I have to get my wife here, so he brought Clara into the room, and they were just overjoyed. Brahms was only 20 years old, and it started this big, long connection between Brahms and the Schumanns. Now, this represents itself musically in many, many ways. Schumann's music is very, as piano music, both Clara and Robert Schumann had fantastic music, and Brahms is a direct continuation of that. We have some pieces actually of all of them that we want to play, and sing through. But what ended up happening is that when Brahms met Robert, Robert was actually in stage 3 syphilis. Had syphilis, and it was at a quite advanced era. And if you know syphilis, it actually sort of eats away at your brain, and sort of like prions basically, makes your brain like Swiss cheese. There's a lot of holes in it. And he eventually went into a mental asylum where the doctors tried to keep him away from Clara for 2 years, and only allowed her to see him when it was clear that he was going to die. And so Brahms actually came back and became almost the head of the household, taking care of the 8 kids of Clara Schumann's, while Clara went off to support the family by basically having a concert career. And so Brahms actually ended up being in the house, basically teaching Clara's piano students, overseeing, because he didn't take care of the kids directly, they had assistants to help out with that. But like 8 kids, right? One of whom was actually, Clara was pregnant with the 8th kid when Robert passed away. No, it must have been when he went to the asylum, because that wouldn't make sense otherwise. The relationship between them was very, very close. And what ended up happening is that Brahms' relationship with Clara Schumann was one of the biggest mysteries of all time. Because, back then, they didn't have email, they had their journals, and we know what they thought because they would write in their journals constantly or write letters to each other. And we know that they had a love for each other that we don't know ever was fulfilled, but they would constantly talk about it in their personal journals. How Brahms, when he wrote the Alto Rhapsody, was so overcome with emotion that he couldn't even talk to Clara. He just kind of put the thing on her doorstep and then ran away. And then when she opened it, she realized that it was a message to her about love and the sort of angst about unfulfilled love and whatnot. And then and they both frantically wrote in their journals, how they just couldn't speak about it because the emotion was so great. And their dedication, I think, to Robert really sort of fueled that. So their music really sort of reflects that same closeness. Now, Robert Schumann and Clara Schumann sort of represent what we call the early Romantic era, right? And Brahms is sort of in that middle romantic era, very heavy. And the way they approach music is very rich. When we say romantic era, that doesn't necessarily mean about topic. It doesn't necessarily mean about love. It means that structure isn't necessarily the most important thing. It's about the emotions, it's about the expression and the musical expansion of harmonies, about the foregoing, starting to rid itself of the previous classical structures beforehand. And so, like we have, I have a piece by Schumann, and this is a very typical thing. Remember that Schumann is a classical, is a pianist, and so this is a work where, you have to remember that we used to have, like, this is Mozart. Clean, elegant, right? And then you have Brahms, or Beethoven, that starts to fool around with that, but still within classical structures. He starts to add introductions, and this is why they have famous stories of people fainting when Beethoven played, because instead of that, you start like this. Right? And it would flat out scare people. You have an entire they were used to symphonies starting off, like, and so you really have sort of, we oftentimes call Beethoven one of those that actually bridged both Romantic era and classical era, because his beginning symphonies started very classically, and then he started expanding them quite a bit. But when you get to Schumann, right, you have these sort of expanding ideas of rhythm, of harmonies, and this piece is actually really quite turbulent that I'm going to play. It's sort of this is one of his piano works from the Davidsbund, and it's. It's written in two time signatures at the same time, right? So you have the right hand. 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2, 1, 2. You have 2 beats per bar, but the left hand is written in 3 beats of the bar the entire time. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The entire time. So not only is the music fast, not only is the music minor, but also what gives it that anxiety is the fact that the rhythms never line up at all. And so listen to it again. I'll play a little slowly. It sounds like the left hand is sort of like inserting itself, and you have this really strong beat from the right hand, and the left hand just tries to sabotage the entire time. Now let me try to salvage what I played before and try to play it again a little bit, but you can hear it again knowing that there's that sort of rhythmic juxtaposition. is that this fact is like he utterly destroys the downbeat. You want to have a downbeat that gives you some drive, and the left hand just tries to do everything it possibly can to destroy that in this part. Now that is not, right? And so, Brahms, when he started to write, really had sort of this richness and style that he was influenced very much by Schumann. He was very conscious, he knew very clearly that he was continuing a musical tradition. In fact, he was so worried about his sort of contributions that he delayed, for instance, writing his first symphony, because he was considered to be the great successor to Beethoven, and Beethoven had the incredible 9 symphonies, so much so that at the 9th symphony he was limited by what was in the orchestra, so he had to add chorus and soloists and become this huge monumental success that was the greatest of the Viennese traditions and whatnot. And then Brahms comes along and they're like, you are our successor to Beethoven. We can't wait for your first symphony. And so he delayed writing it for 40 years because he didn't want to, he wanted his first symphony to be, he wanted to feel like he had full control of his compositional powers by that time. Now, Brahms, when he did write his first symphony, it was almost an homage to Beethoven. The 4th movement has a big chorale in it. I'm going to do my memory. It's this beautiful chorale, and obviously the 9th Symphony of Beethoven is famous for its chorale. That was vaguely volcanic. And so it became one of these really big things where when he did write his first symphony, it was considered to be Beethoven's 10th. There was a reviewer that said, isn't your symphony like Beethoven's 10th? And I think he said, it was like the first time somebody said, like your grasp on the obvious is, astounding. Brahms's musical language picked up that same richness. And so we want to actually sing some of Brahms' pieces. One of his pieces is actually based off of the poetry. It's got on the poetry by one of Schumann's, the 8th child of Schumann. So basically, when Schumann went to the mental asylum and Clara was pregnant, it was pregnant with Felix. And Felix is the one that actually wrote the poetry that this song is based off of. And it's this really... You want to talk about the text for a second?
Sure. It's called Meine Liebe ist grün, which sounds a little funny. My love is green. Not green as in the color, but as in this overflowing of lushness, and there's a lot of natural imagery. It's really beautiful. And he wrote it when he was like 9 years old, I think. And it's really stunning.
And it's one of these things that you would never think that Brahms, who is filled with angst, and what we're going to get to a little bit, which is his relationship with women, is nothing that he would actually, I think, create himself. But his dedication to the Schumanns, specifically because Felix was a baby, he used to call him Leeks. Both Clara and Brahms call them Leeks, which I think is really cute, which is L-I-X. His dedication to them, Felix actually died before Clara Schumann did. And obviously, his death was also very significant to both of them. But, the text is so innocent, right? It's so pure, and it's something that's very interesting juxtaposition. When you have, or we're going to talk about some of the music in this, that has that sort of driving, tumultuous feeling to it. It's almost like it's overflowing and overwhelming. It's very interesting, the juxtaposition between the innocence of the text and the richness of Brahms' writing. So, okay.
Meine Liebe ist grün.
bush, and my loved one is beautiful as the sun, which shines down on the lilac bush and fills it with fragrance and with rapture. My soul has the wings of a nightingale, and it sways gently among the blossoming lilac, and rejoices and sings, drunk with the fragrance, many love-intoxicated songs. Very pure, very innocent. And this music that starts off, you can feel the exuberance. You can feel the energy. You can feel like you could set it. I mean, first of all, it's set in minor. The first chord is minor, which is funny enough as it is. But like the sort of rhythmic energy of it, It could have been so pure and innocent like that. But to have that repeated chords over and over again. That pure, exhilarating energy. And so you can have the same sort of feeling that we talked about with the Schumann, where this is definitely, obviously, a much more dark piece. And you sort of have that sort of turbulence, that energy that's sort of inherent in the music. Now, obviously, Brahms has the compositional power to range all sort of emotions, and the Brahms Requiem, when we talk about it, is notable because it always talks about how there's always salvation, there's always comfort in the face of tragedy, and so like I said, Brahms spent a lot of time sort of with these anxious feelings about Clara Schumann and the anxiety that was built up through it. He pushed down and repressed over and over again. He writes that, and actually there was a big, not fight, but Clara Schumann felt very hurt by his sentiment. Brahms said that the passions of people, right, are just are flighty and should never be taken seriously. It's in the face of everything, you need to have a steady hand and a coolness of temperament. And that's just not who Brahms was. Brahms was overflowing with emotion, and he kind of tried to repress it constantly. And so what ended up happening is, over the years, they would express them to themselves privately, and